Welcome to the L&D Go Beyond podcast, where we gather insights from learning experts which the L&D community can benefit from. This is episode number 13, and we have a well-known and highly respected expert joining us today, Joe Ganci. For those who may not know Joe, let me introduce quickly our expert to you. Joe Ganci is president of eLearning Joe, a custom learning company located outside Washington, D.C. Since 1983, he has been involved in every aspect of learning development. Joe holds a degree in computer science and writes books and articles about e-learning. His mission is to improve the quality of e-learning with practical approaches that work. Joe is a frequent teacher and presenter at industry conferences and client sites, especially on the subjects of e-learning development tools such as Adobe Captivate, Articulate 360 Suite, iSpring Suite, Raptivity, and eLearning Brothers Lecturer. He considers himself a lifelong learner, always studying new tools and new versions, along with instructional techniques and evaluating the results of learning initiatives. He has delivered keynote speeches and taught all over North America, Europe, and Asia, most recently in Warsaw, in Shanghai, in Moscow, and in Dubai. He has received several awards for his work in e-learning, including a Lifetime Achievement Award in 1999 and an eLearning GuildMaster Award in 2013. That's amazing, Joe. I started in e-learning in year 2000. So
Yes.
very warm welcome, Joe. I'm so glad that you're joining us today.
All that to say, I'm pretty old now. I've been doing this a long time. Yeah, that's a little bit.
This sounds magnificent, and we are here to gather some of the wisdom that you would have accumulated over the years. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. And for our audiences, of course, we are going to talk about the 10 questions you must ask at the start of any learning project. Now that's personally a very interesting topic to me. uh, I believe that a lot of learning people may not be doing, fact finding and digging initially. So I'm sure you're going to cover a lot more than that. But to get started, as we were talking about, what to discuss during this podcast, this was the topic that we zeroed on. In your view, why is this an important topic to be discussed and talked about, and for learning people to really listen to this?
It's a good question because anytime you give a presentation like this, you or being asked about this, you want to make sure that it's worthy of the audience, right? And in this case, I think it's very, very important because I have been creating e-learning for a long time, and I've seen so many mistakes happen in the field. Sometimes I've made them, but more often than not, I've been on the sideline looking in and saying, "Oh, no, we can't do that." Primarily, it's when everybody wants to jump right in and start creating learning without doing their due diligence. They don't really investigate what they really need to do during the process of designing and developing learning, and it doesn't even matter if it's e-learning or stand-up learning or virtual learning. It doesn't matter. It's always the same questions that have to be asked. Okay, primarily those questions are the ones that if you don't ask them, you're going to lose a lot of time and money. So that's why I think this is important.
So, I mean, to summarize, if you don't do it right, you're going to lose time and money. That's the very basic.
Yes, that's a short way of saying it. Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. And who are we really directing this conversation at? Is it anybody and everybody related to learning? Is it learning designers? Or who are we really targeting today?
This topic does touch on every role in the learning industry. However, I would say that for people who are in the decision-making areas, like the managers, the lead instructional designers, lead developers, these are the ones that really need to listen the most because they're the ones who are making the decisions as to what's going to happen, what's going to be created, and so on. So because they give direction to others, typically they're the most important roles. However, even those who are brand new to learning need to know these things because if they see that these things are not happening, they need to speak up.
Interesting. All right. Fantastic. So let's dive right into it. Why don't we start with your list of 10 questions, and maybe you want to take up one by one and
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about one by one. I like to sort of do a discovery approach here, and here's the thing. I have been teaching about tools for a long time, right? Especially tools, but I also teach about other topics in the learning industry quite a bit, actually. Well, I was finding that when I was teaching a tool, whether it was Articulate Storyline or Adobe Captivate or any tool, people were coming to my classes, and I found out that they didn't really understand what e-learning or learning was all about. Everybody thinks they know because, after all, we all went to school for many years when we were kids and often when we were adults, and we think we understand how learning works. But in reality, what works in one venue may not work in another. So some of the questions we have touch upon that, but also we start, of course, and this is probably everybody understands this, we start with the audience. And that's where we're going to really focus first. And there are questions about the audience that should be obvious, but then there are others that are often overlooked. And that's where I like to start today. Then, of course, we're going to go into the realm of the technology and the for things like evaluation and so on that will come after that. So let's start with the audience and then we'll go from there. But it's important that we cover all these things because one area alone isn't going to be enough.
Perfect. Sounds like a good plan. Let's start with the audience questions.
Sure. Well, of course, when we start with audience, we know some things right off the bat. We want to know, obviously, what do they need? What is it they really need? And this is funny that, it's a question that seems obvious, but yet oftentimes what I find is that an initiative will start with, we're going to deliver this to the learners, to our employees, for instance, we're going to deliver this. And we're like, okay, let's start with the question as to why. Now, when I have taught my classes, often I have, well, in the last several years, I have taken a few minutes to discuss these questions because I found that a lot of times my students would be assuming, of course, that whatever they're being given as assignments to create online, for instance, is already been vetted. This is important. We have to do this, etc. But often the question as to the learning is what do we have to teach? What do they have to learn, etc. But the question that we really need to ask sometimes is why? Why do they need to learn these things? What is it that's important about this? What is it that may not be important at all that we're still including in this? So it starts with what do they need? Not necessarily what do they want, but what do they need to really do their jobs more effectively? So that's the first real question that we have under the umbrella of who is your audience, is what do they need? Now, in terms of that, I'll give you a quick example. I worked for, as a contractor, I've been on my own since 1998. So I've been creating learning for a lot of different types of organizations. And early on, I developed a course for a petroleum company, and I had started a user group in my area for a tool. They came to that. It was on a Saturday morning, and on Tuesday, I got a call from them saying, "Hey, we need you to come and help us with this because our only good developer is going to be deported." And we're like, "What? Deported? Why?" "Oh, because we're in a hiring freeze right now. We can't sponsor him anymore," and so on. So at the time, I was still working for another company, and I convinced them to hire him and sponsor him. And then we brought him back to the petroleum company, and they were really happy about that because they loved him, but they just couldn't sponsor him anymore. But in the meantime, for 1 year, I was going and creating with them. It was a very large project. Back then, we used to create really big projects, and this was like something like 80 hours of learning. Okay, amazing amount. That obviously, when you have that much, you're not going to take it all at once. Well, 80 hours of learning, and I was brought in midway through a 2-year process. Wow. So 2 years this thing took, and a large team of people. And in the end, it was sent to the refinery workers. And guess what? They said, "No, thank you." Well, what do you mean, no, thank you? Well, this isn't what we need. If you had asked us what we needed, we could have told you, but you just assumed this is what we needed, and this is not something we need.
Mhm.
And so it was over $1 million and 2 years of effort that went wasted because the question, what do they need, wasn't asked. Okay. They just assumed it. So that's a really, really big one. You really need to know what is it that the learners need. So that's number one. Okay. Do you want to ask anything?
Yeah. I had a couple of thoughts on that. So,
Sure.
who needs to ask this and to whom? Are we asking business stakeholders, or are we doing some sort of observation on the job to really understand what do they need? Are we talking to the sample audience, actually people who are going to use that course? Who are you suggesting the learning designers go and ask this?
An excellent question. So learning designers, stakeholders, project managers, these are the people who normally are going to need to ask this question. And the first thing is, yes, of course, what is the business process here that we need to address? Now, very often what we find is that the business process that they're trying to correct or they're trying to improve isn't going to really be helped by learning. It's going to be helped by changing something in that process that is causing it to be a problem. So sometimes learning is not even the answer, and or creating a big learning project is not the answer. Even creating a small learning project may not be the answer. It may be just, oops, if we just cross this T or dot that I, everything will be much better. Okay, so this is some of the initial work that has to be done by the stakeholders and so on. But yes, you also want to talk to the potential audience. You want to choose a few people from that audience that are representative, and then ask them, what kinds of problems are you having on the job? What is it that really causes you stress? How is it that we could make this better for you? Is there something you feel like you need to learn that you aren't learning? That sort of thing. So yes, it's across the board. You want to start with, of course, the business process. What is it that we need to do to make this, to improve this, and to make us more efficient as a company, more productive, and so on. So yes, it's really, the answer to your question is all of the above, really. But you want to start with the business, and then once you are convinced that you think you know what they need, keep going until you really know for sure and have it confirmed.
Excellent. I also like the point that you mentioned, training is not the solution, and many times it is not. But, I realize that it takes a lot of years of experience to be able to say that.
That's true.
So you go through the processes like this example that you mentioned, where the audience simply rejected it. You have to go through those experiences, unless you are in a great place where you have been groomed to, think that way. But most people are probably getting through their own personal experiences and learning it the hard way after many years of grind, and then realizing maybe training is not the solution to everything.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Yeah, that's why it's important to start with those people who are higher level and have maybe had that experience and are able to do that initial work, but then don't ignore the people, of course, who are new to it too, because sometimes they can bring in the best ideas that you never thought of earlier, so.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Let's get to the next question then. Or have we covered more than one already?
Oh, no. Well, really, we're covering still the audience, but I'm going to go through the next several sub questions, if you will, quickly, because these are important questions to ask, but they're all under the umbrella of the audience. In fact, the audience is the one that has the most questions to ask. Okay. So some things are, again, pretty obvious and yet are often overlooked. What is their native language, for instance? Okay. If you're going to be delivering internationally, especially you can't just assume that they're all going to know the language that you speak, right? And so the native language is very important. And in fact, it's also important because you may find that you need to deliver it to several different language groups. I worked on a project for a fast food chain a while ago that had 34 languages they wanted to deliver to. Okay. Now, if you know that at the beginning, you can really be much more efficient and productive when you create your design and your development so that you can more easily swap out languages and so on. But that being the case, if you don't ask that question, you just assume they're all going to know English, French, German, whatever, you're not going to take that extra time, because it is a little extra time to prepare for that. But we're talking about 10% more versus 200% more, because afterwards it's like, oh, we need to deliver this in that language too? Well, gosh, and then you're almost starting all over because you haven't anticipated that. So yes, what is their native language or languages is a big question. What are their literacy levels? Are you delivering to people who are all PhDs or students that have graduated high school and can't do much more? Are they, in fact, younger people still? You really don't know until you know. Now, their literary levels are all about how well will they understand the material, of course. So another important question to ask, you don't want to deliver to PhD something that seems, destined for a 14-year-old, and yet, on the other hand, you don't want to overwhelm a 14-year-old with, PhD level language. So some of them can take it, but not all of them can. All right, so let's see. How diverse is the learner audience? Now, diversity means, of course, that you are representing the audience in very well. If your audience is all very homogenous, you probably get away with not doing this. But most of us are working with people who come from every walk of life, and you really want to make sure that nobody feels left out, that everybody's feeling included in the learning. Okay. And then we get to things that are, even that one is something that's very often not spoken of, but then we get into things that are even more interesting in terms of people never ask these questions, okay? What about using in the design things like religious symbols? Now, in the United States where I live, there are many religions, and we tend to avoid using anything that might be a religious symbol, unless, of course, we're developing something for a particular church or mosque or synagogue or whatever. Okay, that's different. But when you're really doing it for an audience that represents many different religions, you don't want to use those. Having said that, I bring this up, and I thought about this because several years ago I did work in Denmark, and in Denmark of course, they have their population that's religious, but it's much more secular than most countries, okay? And they were using examples to describe the standard operating procedure, SOP. And they did it by showing Moses and the 10 Commandments, etc., as here's an example of standard operating procedure. There was God talking, there was lightning bolts, there's all sorts of things. And I went, really? You want to use this? Because, and he said, oh, in Denmark, it's fine because these are just mythological types of symbols for us. They're not really religious symbols. Okay, well, that's fine. So it depends on your audience, of course, but you don't want to make everything, so centered on one idea of religion. In fact, it's better to avoid it altogether unless you're really learning about religion. Okay. How will they spend their time in learning is another question to ask about the audience, because if they're going to be taking this in snippets, a little bit here, a little bit there, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, that's quite different than, you're going to be given an hour, 2 hours of time to go through it from start to finish. Having that kind of spaced learning can also be very beneficial. So it's better sometimes to take a 10-minute piece, then a day or two later, you're taking another 10-minute, 15-minute piece, etc., and they're building on each other. It really helps to learn more than if you try to do it all at once. But having said that, you need to know, is it something that they need to take in 2-minute snippets while they take other phone calls, or is it going to be more like 20, 30 minutes at a time? Because otherwise you're going to be designing it wrong. You're going to be developing it, in a way that they can't really work with it very well. Now the question is, how motivated will they be? We just assume that everybody's going to be okay with it. They're going to be motivated, but no, a lot of times people see it as onerous. They just don't want to. They don't want to touch it. It's like, oh, I got to learn this too. So motivation is a key ingredient that if they're not going to be motivated very much, then you need to find ways to motivate them in the learning itself. And the best way to do that, of course, is to create learning that is interesting, engaging, and so on, so that they're looking at going, hey, this isn't so bad. I like this. Maybe I should learn this stuff. So that's another good question to ask. So if they're not already motivated, okay, what about accessibility needs? Is there a part of our audience that's going to need to work with the learning that is not able to see or hear or use their mouse, for instance? These are sorts of questions that, again, if you ask them at the beginning, ooh, you can save so much time and money, because knowing that you build that in at the beginning instead of trying to retrofit it after the fact, So very important question to ask as well, that is often overlooked. Job roles. Another question to ask about is job roles, because if you're delivering something to the whole corporation, which is often the case, everybody got to take this, It might be OSHA or safety training. It might be something, sexual harassment training, something that is really everybody has to take. The different roles in there may find themselves dealing with that issue in different ways, and so you don't want to assume everybody is a line worker. You don't want to assume everybody is a big manager. You want to consider different roles, and in some cases that may even mean creating separate learning mechanisms for them. Or, of course, more often than not, you're going to be building that into the learning itself. I've seen examples where the question is asked at the beginning, which role do you fit? And then the learning will we create the learning so that it automatically fits that role, and will choose the examples and exercises that are more pertinent to that role. So there's all sorts of ways to deal with it, but you really need to know, about that too. Okay, I'm going to stop there for the audience, but I'm going to mention some examples of questions that people sometimes ask that really don't matter. They don't matter. So you want to avoid that, okay?
Yeah.
Is the audience male or female? Well, the difference between men and women when it comes to learning there's really no difference, okay? So you really want to, it doesn't really matter in most cases, unless, of course, you're delivering something specifically for male or female, but otherwise, you can just assume that doesn't really matter too much, okay?
Yeah.
At least in my view. I had never seen it matter, let me say that, okay? Is the audience younger or older? That's a big one too, because people are like, oh, well, if it's young, we got to make games, we got to do this. But if it's an older generation, they'll be fine with something a little less frenetic. That's not true anymore. It may have been true many years ago, but now we find that, there are gamers, for instance, who are in their 60s and 70s who love it and really would respond better to something that is more fast-paced. And then, of course, we have those who are more bookish and they like a slower pace sometimes, that are young. So young, old, we're all pretty much in the same boat now. We all work with technology every day. We all have computers. We all have, some experience there. Even the grandma, grandpa who do nothing more than get on a social media to talk to their kids, they still know more than anybody did a few years ago. Okay, so we're learning fast. Yeah. And lastly, the last question I want to ask, and this is one that's a little more controversial, but really it's not, because so many studies have addressed this, learning styles. You see this so much online where people say, you have to consider the style of learning. Do they like to, and this touches upon what we just talked about too, do they like to have fast paced or slow paced? Are they more of the type of audience that likes to read, or they like to watch videos or listen to audio? In the end, we all, unless we have a disability of some kind, we all have ears, eyes. We can muddle through almost anything. There really is no need to address learning styles, because in the end, you don't want to focus. You don't want to try to separate that out. It's a lost cause. If you think that you understand, learning styles, and you are just gonna give this audience this type of learning and that audience that type of learning, it often falls flat in its face. You can look online and look at debunking learning myths. You'll find a lot of material on there. Okay, right. Learning myths are just learning styles are just not pertinent as we once thought. Okay,
we covered native language, which is a great point, because I think there is a relationship we all have with our language, and you can't really easily translate things from one language to another. Sometimes it's not even possible. So yes, I think we need to be very, very conscious of that. But how do you handle that? So you had this program of 34 languages. I'm just curious that, do you try and bring it down to the level of common understanding across languages, or something which is not unique to, let's say, English cultures or English language, that should be avoided, and hence the translation and localization will be a little easier and possibly will work for everyone?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one I didn't really address under the audience, but it's in my handout. I think you can see it there. Because when we talk about languages, we're really also talking about cultures. And cultures are very, very important because in the United States, for instance, where are our sports? We have baseball, we have American football, we have more and more, we have soccer, of course, or football internationally called football. We have other things. Well, we grew up here with these expressions that come from sports. Oh, as a feedback to a learning to a quiz question, you might say, "You hit a home run."
Correct.
What's a home run? If you don't know baseball, you're not going to know what a home run is. Or you set up an animation where you're going to first base, second base, third base, and then your home run. It doesn't really work around the world. It may work only. It's going to work only in Japan, Korea, United States, and those places that really love baseball. Okay. Then, of course, if you're going to listen, I love languages. I speak a few. I've studied them all my life. And I discovered things about languages that really matter as well in cases like this. For instance, when I studied Russian, in Russian, you don't say, "I have a dog." You say, "That dog is to me." Right. So you're changing the focus from the possessor to that being possessed. Okay. And it's very interesting because it makes you think in different ways. When you learn other languages, you're really using parts of your brain you never used before because we are thinking in a different way. Italian is the language I'm fluent in besides English. And that is a language that, again, there are things that don't really translate well, but other things that you really have to not just look at the words and so on, but you also have to understand the cultural basis for that expression. So it really is culture and language together. And if you're going to be delivering e-learning strictly to India, you're probably going to focus on cricket instead of baseball and football, American football. So yeah, there's all sorts of questions there regarding the culture as well. And I touched upon it with the religion and so on, but really you want to understand all of that too. How do you deal with it? You're very careful when you're designing to make sure that you're not using any expressions that would not be understood. You're trying to. It doesn't mean that you have to create boring, plain vanilla types of things, but you can certainly create learning that is very engaging and interesting without bringing into the process things that nobody would understand outside a certain venue. And we don't think about that because we all grow up with these expressions and think that they're normal, but they're often not. Right. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, so maybe what I'm hearing is, trying to just be conscious of the metaphors and references that we use, because so there is one core content that you're working with, and then there is the either examples that you're taking from another field. We need to be careful about that, or any metaphors that we are using, so that we know if this is more generic and possibly better understood across the world, let's use that.
Yes, I agree. There's a famous book that came out many years ago that sold very well called Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. And it's all about what is considered appropriate in every country in the world. And it goes through every country in the world, at least at the time. The countries were in the world, those countries that were available then. Now it's a little different, but not really that much. And understanding the culture so that you don't fall flat on your face when you're being introduced to someone in a different country, that sort of thing. And I find that useful also in understanding how to work with cultures and languages in learning. So it's a good book to have. It's a good book to have.
Fantastic. Okay, let's get to.
By the way, may I say one more thing about that? Again, it's important to understand, to work with people from that audience. So when you're starting, you don't wait till the end, but when you're starting and you have your first lesson done, have someone from every part of the world that's going to be taking this learning look at it and tell you, I don't understand this. What does this mean, etc. Because again, you may be surprised.
Right. Yeah, doing some user testing is always great. Yeah, and if you have a mixed audience, let the testing audience also be proportionately mixed. Yeah.
Exactly. And again, that's something that you want to do right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right.
Great.
Okay.
Absolutely. All right. So this point, which was very interesting, which was how do they spend their time on learning? and it could be more because of their work schedules, their availability of, let's say in retail, maybe they have, computers available, but they can't really leave the job or their front line positions for too long, etc. And in some cases, they may have bulk time, which is assigned by some sort of a mechanism. So we need to work with that. But you also touched on a related point, which was spacing of learning, which brings in a lot of benefits. So, and I know we are going beyond the questions just to see how we can leverage the answers. For people who do not get that opportunity to do spacing, are there ways that learning designers can bring that spacing in?
Funny though, because in reality, it's almost the opposite is more of a problem, where in a sense that if you are being forced to space and you may want to try to do it all at once, you may find that that's more difficult. Okay. In terms of spacing, if your boss says, I'm giving you 2 hours of learning here and you have to take it all at once, you could potentially space that out on purpose yourself to do that. But how do you do it? I mean, obviously, someone who's not well versed in this field, who doesn't really understand learning methodologies, may not understand exactly how to space things either. So yes, it's important to sort of build that in from the beginning. Your question, I want to make sure I understand. Say that last part again of your question.
So, if you have a structure where people get, let's say, 1 hour dedicated time to learn, maybe in a week. Now, if you want to space it out, that they want to do about 10 minutes a day, structurally, they may not be able to do it, but are there any ways that it can be still done? Because spacing does provide real benefits as people keep building on what they have learned, get time to reflect on it, bring that again to the learning experience again the next time.
Well, we're about to go into the topic of content and context, and this touches on this too, because if you're thinking that the learners are all going to be just watching and answering questions and dragging this and dragging that, etc., and they're going to do that the whole time, then you may not be thinking broadly enough. Because if the content, for instance, is really so, let's say that you're someone who has to often research something on your job. Okay, I need to look this up. I need to do this. I need that. Why not make it so that part of the spacing of this is that you start with an initial, piece that you're taking online that is more explanatory, but still engaging. You don't want to ever create something that is next, because people will not, read or listen. They just keep hitting next until they're done. There's a small portion of people who may not do that, but really it's that. So having said that, if you give it so that they start with an initial 10 minutes somewhere, and then the next assignment is go research this, find the answers online, do this, do that, find the answers in our wiki that we have in our business, whatever the case might be, and then come back and answer some questions on that. That could be really, really helpful. I mean, if it's part of their job to do that, you're now addressing that as well. So you want to think outside the box. You want to not focus, I hate that term, but you want to focus on just let's throw everything at them and see what sticks. No, you want to make it so that they are actually actively engaged in the learning process in ways that are not just looking at learning, e-learning types of things, but also are doing things during the process that make it so that they are contributing to their own learning.
I think that's a great suggestion. I really like if we are able to structure a program like that, where there are natural breaks in the type of activity you're doing. You can always space it out yourself also. But I also like the term that you said, actively engaged, because sometimes watching may not be actively engaged. You may or may not learn much from it if you're not doing anything.
Exactly. It's usually not the case at all. So okay. So the audience is really the one where we ask the most questions. But let's talk about the content now, the content and the context of that content. And I say that because let's say that your lesson is on changing the timing on a car engine, okay, something like that. Well, the timing mechanism may be different in different cars. So the context is, well, which cars are we talking about? Am I a Lamborghini, dealership, or am I a Hyundai dealership? It's going to be different. So the context is, in what ways will this topic affect me on the job? Okay, so you need to know the context as well. So the content and the context is where really the why comes in too. When I've taught classes on tools, and I'll ask them, what is it that you need to teach in your own cases, because they come from every different company. And so one person, for instance, said, we're a cable company. We have I work in customer service. And so what we need to do is create learning for customer service. And I said, okay, so what is it you need to learn? They need to learn. Oh, it's this, and this. Okay, now answer me this. Why do they need to learn it? Because they do. Well, who made a decision? This is something they need to learn. Yeah. And they said, well, I don't know. And I said, okay, what would happen if they didn't learn this? What would happen if they didn't have some way of knowing how to do customer service? Oh, yeah. Well, maybe they would mess up on when a customer calls us and asks questions. We may not give the right answers. We may not know how to give the right answers. So the why here is that you're not going to be addressing your customers very well. And that means what? Oh, that means they may drop us as a cable company, go with someone else. We may lose money. We may lose, we may suffer as a company. Aha. So now you're focusing on the why fact. Whenever you do that, it makes it so much easier then to envision what the learning will be, because not only are you going to focus on, the why factor, but you're also going to be very easily moving into things like storytelling. Now, when I say storytelling, I don't want people to go like, what is that? You're not going to be doing fables and such. No. Storytelling simply means you're making the learning more human-based. So everybody loves stories. Everybody loves to read books and watch movies and things that have a story in it. It's rare that you'll see a book or a story that has a movie or a book that has no plot or no real characters or etc. Yeah, you're gonna invest your time in identifying with the hero or the villain. Like I was when I first saw Star Wars, and I felt like when I was driving my car, I felt like, I'm flying an X-wing. I was very excited at the time, but yeah, I was young. But anyway, the point is that it's really meant to help the learner to center themselves in the learning. And again, if they can do that, they're going to be much more engaged. So you want to set up a story, and it could be as simple as giving names to your examples, and you stick with that name. So George or Susan or whoever is going to be is answering calls from customer service. And then a customer service calls comes in the learning. And okay, so the customer is asking this, what do you do? And now you make a decision. Well, now you're getting into choose your own adventure almost, where you're making decisions and then seeing what results. Sometimes it's really, really cool and important that you don't give them answers immediately. Yeah. So if they say, where there's options X, Y, Z, or maybe write in your own option, but okay, whatever it is, X, Y, Z, they choose X, and you say, no, that's wrong, try again. Well, that doesn't help as much as sometimes letting them choose X and then going to the next level, the next step, and then seeing in the end, no, they don't like us. It didn't work. Well, where was the problem? And then you can go back and see, this is where you made your first mistake right here. Okay. And you didn't realize it, so you didn't correct for that. Okay. So thinking through that, the real life process that can cause customers to be happy or sad, for instance, can realistically be very, very pertinent in your learning. So you want to, and then of course, the person on the screen may be George or Susan, but again, giving them a name, giving them a backstory, for instance, sometimes a short one can be really useful in keeping people engaged, because everybody wants the hero to win. They want to see that happen. So content, context, storytelling, all of that comes out of that. And there's so much more I can say about storytelling. And you can read a little bit in the handout, but you can look online for a lot more about that too in the learning area. All right, let me talk about the third big area, which is technology, of course. And that's where we are going to be asking not just, what browser they need to use or what is their computer, what computers are they using, et cetera, but also, what internet speed are they available. Yeah. I worked on a project years ago where it was a worldwide project, and in some cases it was going to small villages where they had no wired connections, but they did have a cell tower and they did have the ability to wireless there. And that changed things a little bit, so you want to ask what the technology is. And I list several different things in the handout that you can read there. So technology, very important there. That leads then to a couple of other questions too, because technology, the content, the context, the audience, all have to be considered when you're talking about things like, what are we going to use for media? Okay. Are we going to be using lots of video? Again, video may not work if it's going to be a low bandwidth audience that isn't able to access that. But video, audio, animations, and so on should never be included just for the sake of having, something interesting to look at, but also has to be pertinent to what the learning is about. It doesn't take much imagination to go from, let's show a puppy playing in the field, to having them, hey, let's show them a video of this process or that process. By the way, a talking head video, very limited. You should not be using that too much. You might use that as an introduction. Welcome to this course, it maximum 30 seconds. But when you have nothing but talking videos on a screen, people don't care. You might as well just have a still picture. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, I did work for the Army here, and it was all about how to save lives for soldiers who have been wounded. Okay, and they wanted the general of the Army to introduce the audience, the learning to the audience. So we brought him in and we sat him down in our studio, and we recorded him. Made a video of him introducing, and we tried to make him a little more animated because he was a general. He was kind of like, okay. And what happened was we did the best we could, but in the end, we actually got someone from the Army calling us and asking, why is it that you didn't create a video of him talking? You just put a still picture up there and then had audio. I said, no, look carefully at his lips. They're moving. Okay. And so the video in that case was a waste. It was really a waste. We could have done just as well as just having a still picture there, okay, with audio voiceover. So yes, you want to consider the reason why you put in a video, photography, other types of images. Scalable vector graphics now are a big thing, which allow resize at different levels without any real issue. Your audio should be important to consider when it comes to, are we going to be using it just for narration, or are we going to be, doing it in other ways too? Interactions is another big question to ask here, and one that's very important to ask at the beginning, because you want to build the types of interactions into your course that are going to be into your learning that are going to matter. So as an example, I will say, if you are teaching a new heart surgery procedure to surgeons, okay, it's something new, and every heart surgeon wants to learn it now, and we want to make it easy for them to learn this. Well, if you're doing it initially online, of course, eventually they're going to do hands-on, but right now it's online, it's the beginning, and you show an example where they have to choose the right scalpel, and then they have to show where to make the incision on the body. And you can do it one of two ways, really, maybe more than two, but the two primary ways that come to mind are, I can show different scalpels on the screen, and when they click it, then the next thing is you click on the body where the incision is supposed to be made, and then the scalpel will move across the screen and make the incision by itself. That would be weird if it happened in real life. It would be also quite dangerous if the surgeon just pointed to the scalpel and then pointed to the part of the body, and the scalpel just flies across the room and probably cuts somebody in the process. So the secondary thing is, well, maybe we should make it a drag and drop because that's more real life in this case. I'm going to not just choose a scalpel, I'm going to drag it to the right place in the body and make the incision. Well, now you're closer to the real life mechanism here. So that's going to be much more helpful. Okay. So the interaction you choose really makes it important to know what is it has to be done here in real life that they're trying to learn, and then use a mechanism that's going to be as close as possible to that. And by the way, in some cases that may be virtual reality. I have a friend actually who works with an airline, and they are using virtual reality for flight attendants to understand the important security measures they have to go through. And by doing that, by doing it in virtual reality, there are certain things that flight attendants have to do. They're not spoken out loud. They're not demonstrated. They're just things they have to know how to do. And they usually are two people together. So an example that he told me was when they close the door of the airplane before it takes off, when they close the door, there's a set of 5 or 6 steps they have to do to make sure it's safe. And another flight attendant has to be watching that person and making sure they did it right. Okay. It doesn't matter if they had 40 years of experience, they still have to have a witness watching it for safety. And then what happens is once the flight attendant is finished with the door, they turn to the other person. The other person will simply go like this to say, good job, or no, there's a problem. Okay. So that would not be easy to translate into, images and such. You need to probably create something more sophisticated, So virtual reality is a natural, but if it's not virtual reality because you're not going to be able to use that approach, then at least have video where you're showing the person, you are the flight attendant doing the work, and then you can see, let me see the witness, and the witness then does this or that, depending on what you did in the learning. So all of these are interaction types that you need to consider. Are you going to have a slider? Are you going to have this? Are you going to have that? Whatever makes sense for the learning itself. We're almost done. You want to also focus on the progress tracking and evaluation. Well, progress tracking, that's separate. Evaluation is really where you're evaluating the course to know, did it work? Is it helpful? Have learners really been more productive now on their jobs and so on? It's a little difficult to do sometimes, but it's really important to understand if all that effort was worth it, because if it wasn't, you'll want to repeat the process. You want to create something that's a little less than that, or you want to focus on a different approach. Okay, so when it comes down to evaluation, that's a secondary question here. The primary one here is, how will learners be tracked? And to know that, you just have to know, are you working with an LMS? Are you working with a learning record store, a learning management system? Are you using a custom-made measure yourself, and so on? Lastly, you have things like, how will updates and maintenance be performed by others in the future? Well, that means if you know that it has to be updated in the future, you want your design to be clear, you want it to be available to those in the future, but also your development should be well commented, and so on, so that when you're developing your course in whatever tool you're using, that you place comments in there so that any future people who need to focus on this to update it will understand what you did. Sometimes I will work on something, and then 6 months later I look at it and go like, what was I doing here? It's like, it works, but I don't understand what I did. Oh yeah, now I understand. It takes a while sometimes to remember things like that. So even for yourself, it's good to comment on things. Last thing is, are you going to be including any social network needs? It used to be that if you were trying to work on a learning mechanism, an e-learning, for instance, and then you ask somebody who's also taking that learning, hey, what's the answer to this? Well, that was called cheating. But a lot of things now, what we used to call cheating now is more like collaboration if you do it right. And collaboration means that you are setting things up, because most of us don't work by ourselves. We work on teams, even virtually. You want to make sure that your learning reflects that. And that means that sometimes it's not just a question of, I have to take this learning, but, I need to work with others on this learning so that we have the right results, and that may mean that you're working with people who are in different roles, or simply, you're on a team of peers, but all together you have to focus on that. So this is something that makes you think harder than just giving everybody the same thing all the time, but it's worth it. It really is worth it. So hopefully that's helpful. There's a nice little checklist at the end of my thing. And by the way, this is not all the questions. Everything we just discussed, there are other questions too that may be pertinent to any organization out there that have nothing to do, that are beyond what we just talked about. And that's, again, one of the questions is, what questions must we ask? So I'll leave it there. Yes. Anything else I can help with? Tell me.
Yeah. So I think there's a great list of questions. I just had one follow-up, which was on the content and context part, which you gave a great example about the salespeople, and when you ask them why, they probably did not have an answer and just thought because they have to. But then are we really looking at something like, digging deeper by asking why, like the 5 why technique, so that we get to the core reason why they're looking at it, so as you keep answering that why, probably we'll get to that in hopefully 5 attempts or lesser.
I like that question. Okay, so when we're little children, of course, we tend to ask why all the time. Why is the sky blue? Why is water wet? Things like this, and that's how we learn growing up. And asking the question why in this case, although it's not the same thing, is really pertinent, because if you don't understand the reason why someone is taking a course, you may not ever really create the course correctly. Okay, you want to focus on the real life consequences and ramifications of doing something wrong based on the reason that that's a wrong thing to do or right thing to do in real life, right? So I would say that you don't have to, it's not something that has to take a lot of time. You may be able to do this all in a day or less, but you need to understand, why am I giving this to learners? What is it that they would not be able to do if they don't get this right, etc.? Did I answer your question, or is there something I'm missing?
I think that's correct, because most people will start with a lower level why, which is, if they don't do this, they will not meet targets, let's say, or the customers may not like it. And then they will, and what, or how does that impact you? Why is that important? Then you keep getting down one level and you probably explore the real reason why they should be doing it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think it's something I always look at, and even when I work with customers who tell me this is what we need to do, I'll often engage them in conversation and say, okay, so what is the reason they have to learn this, etc., because it helps me also to understand what the design should be, and of course how to develop it as well. So sometimes they're surprised when I ask the question, but in the end they understand the importance of it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Joe, this has been a great conversation. Mostly a lot of your knowledge, which has come out in these questions, which would be helpful. And just for our listeners and people who are watching on YouTube, we will have a handout from Joe, which will be available in the resources section. So that should be additionally helpful. But this has been wonderful, Joe. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to talk with you. Okay, have a wonderful rest of the month and year.
Same to you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye now.